Welcome to our KQLCafe May 2024 already. We're heading straight into the summer period. We'll have another episode in June, and then in July, we're going to take a break. And in August, we'll have a slightly different schedule. So normally we're always doing the last Tuesday of the month. In August, if I'm correct, that will be 1 week earlier. And then in September, we still have to find out when and how we're going to do it, because at the same time, Johnny and myself will be at the Workplace Ninja event that takes place in Lucerne, Switzerland for the whole week. But we might be actually even streaming something online and see if we can catch some KQL enthusiasts out of the audience or from the speaker crew. Okay, let's get us started. So as always, Johnny and myself, your hosts, and the agenda. We'll have some updates, latest news, where we can find KQL things, or where we can actually practice our KQL, some references to blogs that I consider worth noting. Then today we have a special guest, Nicola Suter, who will join us and talk about his KQL experiences. And then we'll have some learning about KQL. And last but not least, as always, what did you do with KQL? Where Johnny and myself will share some of the, let's call it KQL snippets that we produced in the last couple of weeks since our last show. So for the news, as I already briefly mentioned prior to recording, the book is now out. So Definitive Guide to KQL. I got my copy already, really worthwhile the money, I would say. You also find all the queries publicly available on the GitHub repo. But if you want to have more insights on, why they use certain approaches and functions, etc., I would definitely recommend to buy this ebook, or I don't even know if you can get it in hard copy, but I got an ebook. Yeah.
And we are in it, of course.
Yeah. Thanks for that, by the way, to the authors for mentioning the KQLCafe as a good source of information for KQL. Yeah, really appreciated that. Always fun to read, or to basically find yourself mentioned somewhere, and well, basically that tells us that we obviously do the right thing here. In terms of news, first of all, we have a new table called CloudAppEvents. It now basically allows us, for those that use Defender XDR, to basically also query data that originates from Defender for Cloud. Previously, if you wanted to query information from Defender for Cloud, you would have to go to the Defender for Cloud portal and do things through your resource graph. There, as we showcased a couple of shows ago, but you will now also find information in this table. I've gone across some tenants. I didn't find data everywhere. I don't know whether it also has to do with the permissions or whether my cookie wasn't refreshed. But in my own tenant, yes, indeed, I see events. So anything like data connectors when you work with Sentinel, storage account activities. So definitely interesting. If you, as an example, are not already ingesting your audit logs through Microsoft Sentinel from Azure, you might now at least have the opportunity to see some of the activities in the other way through Defender for Cloud. Then there's also a cool article I want to highlight, hunting in Azure subscriptions. There's some guidance there. Basically, it goes across various tables like the signing logs, as well as the CloudAppEvents table that again you have in Defender for XDR. So that's definitely also worth reading, and there are a couple of good KQL examples in there. And last but not least, last month we spoke a lot about the Microsoft Security Exposure Management, and we have 2 great blog posts from Sami here, with also a lot of cool references when using the new exposure management data tables. And with that, I would like to introduce and hand over our guest for this month, Nicola Suter.
Thank you very much, Alex. Should I directly steal the sharing over from you?
Definitely, yeah.
Well, let's give this one a try. So you should be able to see my slides. Maybe a few words about myself. So as you've heard, I'm called Nicola Suter. I live in Switzerland. I actually have the pleasure to work at the same company as Alex does. I work together with him as a security consultant for Base Vision. From a technical perspective, I'm mainly interested into all topics related to security, identity. That's also the reason why one of my bigger interests is related to the topic of ITDR, identity, threat detection and response. I also started getting hands-on a lot about KQL stuff, and also like to automate things with PowerShell. When I'm not working, I like to do ski touring. So the picture over here was like taken 1 week ago. Apparently there's still lots of snow in Switzerland during summer, and other times I actually like to do cycling and running and all that stuff. Occasionally I get like lost at conferences. So I was like at the MMS a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, maybe good to know I'm on Untapped as well, because I like to have some beers from time to time. And like I just got awarded the MVP title at the beginning of this month for various contributions around all the Microsoft topics, I think. Thank you, Johnny. And I think with that, we're ready to go to actually tackle the focus topic of today a little bit. I mentioned just before the term ITDR. That's basically a little bit of a newer term for those of you who have already visited the security.microsoft portal recently. There's a new blade when you visit that identity portal. So it's basically a little bit of a newer topic. Gartner and other institutions like launched a new term around ITDR. That's basically everything related to the identity, threat detection and response parts. And as we can see here, that discipline or newer term basically consists of 2 focus areas. So the first one is basically the general identity and access management as we know it from the past. And there's also the detection and the response part. And that's rather a newer discipline in terms of technology. That's exactly where Defender for Identity, Entra Identity Protection, and basically that stuff resides. And if we combine those 2 topics, that's what the term ITDR actually leaves us up. So if you haven't checked out that new dashboard, definitely check it out. They provide some nice recommendations and measure over there. And my goal of today is actually to elaborate some of the preventive measures we can actually take around the topic of ITDR that you can also adapt for your daily consulting or engineering work, or maybe also as part of your environment itself. As I started like almost 9 or 10 months ago, a little bit of a GitHub repository where I started to collect some of the KQL queries I use around the term of ITDR. But as this is a rather new discipline, there's not yet a very strict definition, but that's basically the definition that also Microsoft uses. Not sure whether there is a question because someone just raised their hand. Just feel free to speak up. Or if that was an unintended like, I appreciate it as well. All right, then let's keep rolling and have a little bit a look on what we'll actually cover today. So basically my little playbook for today is basically to show you some Entra stuff. We start with the whole topic of cross-tenant access, then work our way towards conditional access, have a couple of tips and tricks in that area, how you can actually identify gaps, how you can like lower your costs and save some bucks by stripping off some conditional access telemetry data as part of your sign-in logs, how we can basically keep track of invisible directory attribute changes. And if you have enough time, we'll also dive into the topic of passkeys itself. These are like the topics from a product or technical perspective, and from a KQL perspective, I actually like to highlight two of the topics I want to dive a little bit deeper. The first one, that's the MV apply keyword that basically helps us to extract nested data without hard coding array indices and things like that. And the second one is like the external data operator. I use a couple of times for that. Basically, to kick this one off from a technical perspective, the first thing I want to talk about is the whole area of cross-tenant access. When I talk to customers, I often notice that this leads a little bit to confusion, especially if you add conditional access to the table as well. So really simple explained. When you have an Entra ID tenant, you have a regular user account. That's basically your user's home tenant. If your user account gets added to another tenant as a guest account, that's then basically called the resource tenant. And that whole scenario, when you access from your home tenant, the resource tenant, that's called cross-tenant access. That cross-tenant access can basically happen in two directions. As we see it here, that's basically the outbound direction. So you live in that home tenant and you want to access resources in a resource tenant. Now, but what not many people actually know about is when we add conditional access to the table, when you access a resource tenant, the conditional access policies in your home tenant are usually not evaluated. So only the conditional access policies from the resource tenant are being evaluated when you access a resource in the resource tenant. Basically, that resource tenant is also where your guest object actually lives. And I think it's quite an interesting topic to actually see if you have a tenant and the corresponding sign-in logs of your Entra ID, which resource tenants your users are actually accessing, and also how you can basically restrict that a little bit if you say that you want to restrict which tenants your users are actually allowed to access. For that, I actually prepared an example. So let's head over to the Entra ID and KQL portal. So where is the browser window? Somehow can't select that one, but let's give it one more try. Otherwise, I would just share the whole screen. There it is. below is then also some information, which one was like the resource tenant, so the tenant the user accessed, and what was the user's home tenant itself. Now what we can do, we can basically filter those logs a little bit more to filter out our own tenant ID and maybe other tenants you don't want to see in the results. And then we can just do a summarization of those to basically get a list of all the resource tenants that were accessed. Let's do that one as well. And then we should get like a nice list of all the resource tenants that were accessed. Now that information is maybe not that valuable because it would be nice if you would know which resource tenant that one is. Also, if we want to work our way up to maybe restricting which resource tenants our end users should be allowed to access, we don't want to block anyone, so it would be nice to have some more context information. Maybe that's already an organization we're collaborating with, and so on. To actually do that, there's an API available we can use. We can basically also discover that API through the portal. If we head here back over to the Cross-Tenant Access settings, I can say that I want to add an organization. And the cool thing here is I can just basically enter a tenant ID and it will resolve to the organization name. So let's take here the example of gustoking.com. I think some of you know to whom the tenant belongs. Actually like the name. If it loads, let's give it one more try. There's a small typo in it, Custo. So we basically see that the tenant belongs to CustoWorks, and we also see the tenant ID. Now we can also do the opposite. If we just have the tenant ID, we can perform a lookup as well. So that's quite a handy feature. Of course, when you have a real tenant and not just a lab environment as I do, you don't want to look up all those tenants manually. If we would spin up our browser, we see that the API that hides behind that is basically just the Microsoft Graph API. So what we can do now is if we head back over here to the query results, we can just say that we want to export the results we have in place. Now let's take PowerShell to our help. So I prepared here a little bit of a snippet that does basically the following things. It will import the query results. It will prepare a map to basically then store the resolved tenant names itself. And we'll just import the CSV, loop through all the tenant IDs, and we'll then just query the Microsoft Graph API. And we can do that by calling this find tenant information by domain name API endpoint and just specify the domain name or the tenant ID as an argument over here. Before that, we make sure that we're actually connected to the Microsoft Graph API, and then we'll just invoke the corresponding requests. So let's do that. And as a result, if we have then a look into this translated domains hash table, we basically see here the tenant ID. We already had that one, but we also see then the display name of the tenant and the default domain name. So we can easily use that one to resolve that information in bulk. Now with that, we can actually go one step further. So let's head back over to the browser. And what would be cool if we can just leverage that information as part of a watch list, for example, in Sentinel. So we head over to our Sentinel workspace. So we could go over here and create that watch list. I already did that, like in a baking show, prepared that one already for you. I called that Cross-Tenant Orgs. And as part of that watch list, I just uploaded basically the export of the CSV file that we saw before, enriched with the tenant domain name and the display name. Now, the nice thing is, if we head back over here to the query section, we can basically run the same query again, but leverage the watch list to do a lookup. The lookup is basically just the lazy way to do a join, because I don't like to do joins and don't know by heart which join always to use. The thing I want to usually do is a lookup to just enhance basically the data based on that tenant ID field over here. And now if you basically run the same query combined with a lookup where we query the watch list, we then see a nice report of all the external tenants that were accessed, and additionally also grouped them basically by the time generated field on a rolling weekly basis. So we basically see which tenants are accessed by my users. This watch list could then, of course, also be used for further things. So, for example, if you want to set up an analytics rule, you could like enrich your query results to automatically include the externally accessed domain name, for example. And there were also already cases, especially in phishing attacks and things like that, where attachments were like hosted in external tenants. So you could also build detection logic around that if someone accesses a resource tenant, for example. So I hope that example showed you a little bit what the cross-tenant settings are, where you can find those in your Entra ID portal, and also how you can basically nicely combine some KQL and some PowerShell to get some enriched data for that.
Very cool. And we could even take it a step further and even automate the creation of the watch list, right? Using an automation account, basically distincting all the tenant IDs that get found, and then automatically populate the watch list, so I don't have to repeat that manually.
Exactly. I'm sometimes afraid because you're mostly reading my mind, but I was like thinking the same. And if we combine that, like I think the second last occurrence of the KQLCafe, Fabian Bader showed a really nice solution they use to dynamically update the watch list. So you could like build an automation, got that tenant ID already translated into the watch list. If not, just add it, and then you have like a nice watch list. You could also like use that as some sort of a governance control to maintain like your approved tenants your users are actually allowed to collaborate with before you then also lock the outbound access for your users. What's maybe also interesting, that cross-tenant access thing, that's like the lightweight implementation. You could go even one step further from a configuration perspective and then also enforce things like tenant restrictions, because the cross-tenant access settings are like only applicable if you have guest accounts or B2B direct connect. But for example, if I would use on my device an account with the custoking.com UPN, if you want to block that one as well, you would then require to implement tenant restrictions actually.
Okay, yeah. And maybe also worth mentioning, there are actually out-of-the-box analytic rules that monitor the cross-tenant settings. So if you happen to use Microsoft Sentinel, check out the analytic rule templates there as well.
Yeah, that's a good hint. And what I also noticed, there's also a workbook available in Entra ID that basically does a similar thing, but unfortunately the workbook also doesn't translate the tenant domains for you. So you just see the tenant IDs. If you're not that familiar with KQL, you could also use the workbook. The workbook doesn't use the sign-in logs by default. It just uses the Entra telemetry from the Entra portal. Right, then let's keep rolling and head over to the next block of topics. So basically talk a little bit about conditional access. So the idea there is that we want to basically be able to detect some of the blind spots where we have scenarios where conditional access policies didn't get applied, although we think that they should apply to all users. So also for that one, I've prepared an example. The idea behind that is, where is it? I think it's that one. Just let me copy that one over. So if you have conditional access deployed in your environment, you would like assume that the conditional access policies get applied to all of your users. That would be the ideal scenario, but probably everyone has things like break glass accounts, Entra ID Connect service accounts, and things like that. That's the reason when you have a closer look into your sign-in logs that you will see that for some of the sign-ins, the conditional access status will say not applied. If you have a closer look on that, for example, we see here that an app called Microsoft Authentication Broker was basically used by a user. It was called admin at my tenant over here. And now we can actually combine lots of nice things to drill down there a little bit more, because probably also have things in your tenant like break glass accounts or users that are just by design excluded from conditional access policies. So what we can do now is actually, if you have Sentinel deployed and configured the Weibo as well, you can basically leverage your identity info table and query the users that are part of your exclusion group. So let me elaborate that a little bit more. We can basically specify here the names of our Entra ID groups that contain the exclusions. So for example, I maintain here an exclusion group called exclusions long-term, where I have like my break glass admin account and my Entra ID Connect sync accounts. That's just a role assignable group in Entra. What we can do now is then query the identity info table. We just make sure that we take an argmax here, that we get like only the most recent information for each user account. The 360 days is probably a little bit too high, but to keep things simple, I'll just leave it like that. And what we can do is query all of the users that are member of that group. So let's actually do that. So we get back here 3 results, my break glass account and 2 of my Entra ID Connect service accounts. With that information in mind, we can basically head back over to that query where we want to search for conditional access gaps, because we want to exclude those accounts which are excluded from all of the conditional access policies, of course, and basically find additional gaps in terms of applications, but maybe also users where conditional access didn't apply to. So let's have a closer look on that one. To actually do so, we will just query the sign-in logs. Theoretically, we could also include the non-interactive sign-in logs, but to keep it a little bit simpler, let's stick with the sign-in logs. We filter here for the conditional access status of not applied. We then also filter out results that contained tenant restrictions, because those also refer to cross-tenant access settings, and that's more specific towards my environment over here. What I also started doing is actually to curate a little bit of a list that's semi-ish official information. So basically we have some apps from a client app perspective, but also some apps in the background from Microsoft that don't process any conditional access policies. Now that sounds like a security nightmare, but I even found like a YouTube video from someone from the product group explaining that one quite nicely, where they say that they use internally some bootstrap applications where conditional access actually cannot cover that, because like they already perform the conditional access evaluation in front, and then they use some internal apps behind that. And it's a little bit of a weird situation because they're quite open with the telemetry that they use those sort of bootstrap applications internally. But yeah, it is what it is. But we also know, for example, that the Windows sign-in, if you use Entra ID joint devices or the Microsoft Authenticator broker, doesn't basically support evaluating conditional access policies. And that's basically the list I mentioned before of those bootstrap applications where I've seen like tons of tenants where we don't have conditional access policies being evaluated. As you can see, those bootstrap applications are often referring to Intune, and we already have apps in conditional access that are selectable or included, like the Microsoft Intune enrollment or the Intune app itself. But if we run that query to basically provide us the apps that should be protected or protectable through conditional access, we get here back a nice list from my tenant in that case, and we can see that we have quite some gaps involved over there. So we can see that, for example, the Azure Virtual Desktop Client is not targeted with MFA, the same for the Windows 365 portal. And maybe the worst is, where is it? For example, the Azure portal isn't covered as well. So that would then be a nice foundation to basically work our way through that a little bit more, to then also get the particular user principal name, and then also head back over to the conditional access configuration to see whether these user accounts were like just excluded from individual policies, or maybe this is also a policy where we just selected the apps manually instead of choosing like the include all apps and things like that. So that's a thing I quite like to do in new engagements, to get a quick of an impression about how major the conditional access setup is already, because when you see that there's like bunch of applications and bunch of accounts that are excluded from all of the conditional access policies. Because even if a user account cannot do MFA, you could still like leverage conditional access policy to limit the sign-in to named locations and still make sure that that user account isn't vulnerable to legacy authentication and things like that. To go one step further here, after we identified some gaps, like from a process perspective, you would maybe like then to deploy some new conditional access policies. That's maybe a thing you already know, but probably not everyone. So in your Entra ID, if you go to the conditional access section and visit some of the policies, you already see here as part of the policy snapshot that some of the policies are basically configured in report-only mode. And the cool thing is when you have your sign-in logs available, at least in a log analytics workspace, or even better in your Sentinel, we can then basically leverage that report-only status to predict the impact of that policy. So I created yesterday evening a policy over here with an evil name called Kill Everything, because that policy is targeted towards all of the users, and it says block access. If I would turn on that policy, I'd probably have a big problem because I would lock out all my users from the tenant. To prevent so, you hopefully have educated your admins and your colleagues to always first deploy your policies in report-only mode. What I see from time to time that people aren't familiar though what it means to leverage then also that kind of data you basically get back from that report-only mode. So a cool thing we can actually do is if you query your sign-in logs, quickly do that. We basically see there a column called conditional access policies. That column is basically just an array of all the individual conditional access policies that are deployed and effective for that particular user. When I talk about deployed, this means that the policy can be enabled, it can be disabled, or it can be in report-only mode. And to basically work our way through, this might look a little bit overwhelming, especially from a KQL perspective. At least that's what I did for me when I started with KQL, because there's like a bunch of a list of all those policies. But now you have maybe the challenge that you newly created a conditional access policy like that kill everything policy. Of course, this would be a more reasonable policy, and you want actually to find out what would be the impact of that policy. So what we can do, we use a little bit of a KQL helper. That helper is called mvexpand. Because right now we have the challenge that as part of that conditional access policy array, this is basically unordered, or we don't have any guarantees that always the policy is at a certain location in that array, because that's not deterministic in which order the conditional access policies are evaluated. So that little bit of an mvexpand helper will basically expand that array and like flatten the record over here that we have only one entry as part of that conditional access policies. So let's see how that looks like. If you run that, we see that we got a little bit more records, because I said take 10, and now suddenly we have 210 records because it basically got expanded. And the nice thing is, as we only have like one conditional access policy mapped to one sign-in, we can now nicely query that one. And we can do so by just filtering for that conditional access policies result. That's basically whether the policy was evaluated successfully or not. And we can filter here if you're particularly interested in the report-only policies for a report-only failure. That's basically how that field is called if you run that in report-only mode. So let's do that again. We see that we quite managed to narrow down the results a little bit. We have again a look over here. We already find that kill everything policy again. If you have lots of conditional access policies and you're just interested in a particular one, you can go one step further and say that you're only interested in a particular policy based on the display name. You could also just right click over here and filter for that. And then you get only the results back that refer to a particular policy. Now, maybe you have some colleagues that try to add some stones to your pathway to make this one a success. So it could be that they renamed some of the conditional access policies. So it might be not the strongest indicator to just rely on the display name. So you can also just leverage that ID over here. If you have a conditional access policy open in your portal over here, you can nicely identify here the ID of that policy. That's basically the same one we have over here, starting with 88. And then you can directly filter for all of the sign-ins with that particular policy. And you could then also summarize that one again to basically get a little bit of a more concise result. So which apps would be affected and how many users until you deploy that policy in a report-only mode. You could then also do the same if you're troubleshooting something, or maybe sometimes customers have that thing like hypercare. So you adjusted something in conditional access and suddenly they think every issue they encounter the next 1 hour is also related to conditional access. So a thing that I like to do then is usually to say that we then filter here for failures actually to get back all the failed sign-ins. Now, if you're nervous like me, or maybe your customer is then nervous as well, he will just hit here run all the time. You can do that, but there's even an additional thing that you can do if you have Sentinel, and that thingy is called hunting. And what you can do over here is a thing called a live stream. And that's pretty cool because as part of that live stream, let's call it one hypercare, you can just enter your query. You don't need to specify like any kinds of time-based filtering and things like that. And then it will basically evaluate your query. You can hit play over here. And as the sign-in logs basically get ingested into your Sentinel, you get like real feedback from a timing perspective. So as soon as the logs get ingested, if there would be any failure, it's basically visible over here without your customer or you being nervous and hitting the F5 key or run query thingy all the time. So that's quite a thing I like to do after I adjusted some major conditional access policies to make sure that we don't stop too many people from working.
Nice.
You could then also save that live stream in case your colleagues or the customer isn't that familiar with the KQL syntax itself. Then you can save that one, and then you can also like rerun that live stream at a later time. It's also the idea behind that live stream thingy when you remediate the thread, for example, and you want to see whether the bad guys still try to come in through a specific IP and things like that, to see that one in real time. So with that, seeing how we can identify some gaps, how we can proactively prevent locking out half of our company, we quite took some advantage of all that telemetry that comes with the conditional access policies. Now, a thing that we realized during real world engagements is, especially in environments that had previously no or just 1 or 2 conditional access policies that were rather configured little bit too open for today's threat landscape. They were just like require MFA for a subset of users and things like that. Once we started to deploy more conditional access policies, this had suddenly led to increased costs for the Entra ID sign-in logs and the non-interactive sign-in logs. Why is that? As we have seen before, if you have a look here on the sign-in logs, we can see that basically as part of every sign-in, all the applicable conditional access policies are basically being included in the ingested logs. And this is rather static data because considering a rolling window of 30 days, probably you change like 1 or 2 conditional access policies, but you still get all that amount of data over here. Johnny told me yesterday that they even have like 60 conditional access policies. If you have lots of sign-ins in a bigger tenant, this can definitely lead to some more costs. So what we can do, we can actually try to visualize this a little bit. For that, I would just union basically the sign-in logs and the non-interactive user sign-in logs table. Do that for a particular amount of day. And what we can do, we can basically leverage that estimate data size function and specify here a column name or a whole table if we wanted to do so. And we can basically convert that towards more human-readable units like megabytes or gigabytes itself. And I was actually quite surprised, as this is like my lab tenant. It has like those sample user packs deployed and things like that. And if you just have a look here of the ingested amount of megabytes, let's adjust this a little bit. I already in my little tenant, I get quite some impressive numbers. I mean, it's about 20 users, 2 or 3 users that work regularly and already have like 5, sometimes like 10 megabytes of ingestion per day, just based on that conditional access policies that are evaluated all the time. And if you have, of course, 50,000 users, 100,000 users, maybe also user accounts that are disabled, but they still try to sign in all the times and appearing in the non-interactive user sign-in logs, this can be quite a big impact from the cost perspective. So the cool thingy that, to be honest, one of my colleagues figured out, but sharing is caring, that we can do in such a situation is basically deploy a data collection rule towards the table to basically strip off the conditional access policies. So how can we do that? There are basically 2 options. Either from your Sentinel, you can head over to the settings over here and then say that you want to go to the workspace settings, or you can just directly open your Sentinel enabled workspace from the log analytics perspective. You can then head over to the table section over here and then basically select your table. So in my case, I already did that for the non-interactive user sign-in logs. Just for the demo, let's select another one here. Then you can basically say create transformation. Because I already prepared that one, it says over here, edit transformation. We basically see that this is then associated with a data collection rule. You can basically only have one data collection rule per table. Hit on next over here, we basically directly see the transformation in place. And all I did, or actually we did in that particular case, we just did a project away to basically get rid of the conditional access policies over there. Of course, you could tailor this a little bit more towards your needs, although I want to mention that we only did that for the non-interactive sign-in logs, as these are actually a little bit higher from a volume perspective. And for a troubleshooting perspective, it was still sufficient to have the conditional access policy status, as I showed it before, as part of the sign-in logs itself. What this one will do, it will actually just strip off the conditional access policies column. So we only have here the conditional access status retained. But this was then a quite of a game changer in terms of saving some costs for that. Of course, if you're really worried about cost and have high volume logs, you could consider additional columns. Like, for example, one thing that I noticed that could also be quite noisy is, for example, if you have a look on that authentication processing details column. So what Entra ID does here, it tracks some of the internal things from the client. So whether is your client still coming with a TLS version 1 and things like that. Usually that's also rather static. So you could also decide that you want to strip off that column. Then an additional thing, if you have deployed authentication contexts in your Entra ID for PIM or other things, those authentication contexts are usually also evaluated as part of almost every sign-in. So you could also decide that you want to strip off that column as well. But I think that's quite a handy tip to actually reduce the amount of logs you're actually ingesting by just deploying that little bit of a transformation over here. But you could theoretically also didn't invest too much time for that. You could also like decide if you only require a subset of your conditional access policies based on the display name or on the ID. You could also introduce like an additional property and only retain a subset of all the policies you have in place. Although this is probably then a little bit more error prone and also more difficult to operate if you need to think about adjusting your data transformation rule itself. And ultimately, if you also have like the conditional access status available as part of the Entra audit logs itself for 30 days, and that's usually also enough for troubleshooting things.
Oh.
All right, then let's conclude here the topic of conditional access itself. I think Johnny and Alex will just interrupt me when I have talked for too long, but I've actually 2 more topics coming up.
Just go ahead.
So the next one coming up is towards attribute changes in your Entra ID. Let's have a little bit of a closer look towards that. So the use case we had over here was basically a customer that had some things like, I don't want to say privileged access workstations, but they had like admin workstations in place, and they basically wanted to get notified or informed when such a new admin workstation like got provisioned, and they leveraged basically Windows 365 for that purpose. The reason why they wanted to know about that is basically those devices over here, they have like some attributes in place. Unfortunately, even here from an Entra perspective, we directly see all of the attributes because there was like an attribute that was referring to the enrollment profile name of that device. Why was the customer particularly interested in that one? The reason actually was or is, again, conditional access. Because in conditional access, we can basically do a thing called device filters. So if we head over to conditions, we can select here filter for devices, and we can basically select here a device property. So what the customer had in place, they filtered based on that enrollment profile name, and then starts with, and they had like a prefix called privileged access workstation, something like that, basically. Now, the difficulty is that it's not so easy to track that change because a malicious actor could just try to modify a device, either from the Intune side or if he gains like access to Entra ID, just try to update that device attribute itself. So we wanted to shed some light into that blind spot. Of course, the first thing I actually tried was basically just to look into the audit logs of Entra ID, because each time you update the device, or even when Intune updates a device, we get basically a record logged called update device from an operation name perspective. We also see here some details, but unfortunately not everything. I expected basically that thingy to appear as part of the target resources, because usually over here we have that modified properties available. But as you can see over here, it only contains some of the properties and definitely not all of the properties that are associated with that device. Because, for example, here that enrollment profile would be missing. So what we actually ended up, because this provided us even more benefits that we initially thought of, what we can do in Entra ID, there's a thing called administrative units. It's basically the successor and more modern version of your Active Directory organizational unit, because those administrative units can do way more things. But what we actually use them for on such an administrative unit, we can basically use a thing similar to the dynamic groups we have available in Entra ID. So we can basically specify here a rule syntax. We used here again that enrollment profile reference and filtered based on that. Because if you remember again, the customer used that device filter in the conditional access policies and they wanted to get notified when there's a new of such a device type. So once we configured here that dynamic rule, what Entra ID does, it will dynamically update basically all of the computers that have that enrollment profile present. So they get added automatically to that administrative unit. And the good thing is, once Entra performs such an update, that's actually an event that's visible within the audit log, so we could reach our ultimate goal of tracking when a new device gets added. The additional benefit that I briefly mentioned before, we can basically tag those administrative units as restricted. This means you can only modify one of those device objects if you have an explicit role assignment towards that administrative unit. That's the reason why even I'm a global admin, I can't say delete over here because that object is protected. But let's keep the focus here on the KQL side of things. So basically, once such a device appears in Entra ID will log an event over here. That event is basically called add member to restricted management administrative unit. If we run that one, we get here a couple of results back. We have again then this target resources section. We see here that we have two properties in it, so it's quite a nested attribute over here. But based on that, we basically see to which administrative unit the device was added. And as part of the second information, we see then here also the device ID. So that's definitely quite handy. And we see here as part of the display name of the device itself. So I already had here then the data that I basically needed for that purpose. Now, the difficult thing was basically to aggregate that data that we can also take advantage of that one, because as you see, we have here that target resources. That's an array. As part of that array, we have here in the first position some things related to the device. Then we have here that modified properties where we have again an array. So it was quite a challenge for me, as I'm not yet the KQL or the Custo King, as Johnny would say. So I want to share here some of the tips and tricks that actually helped me to parse the data a little bit more. So the first thing that I used was again that MV expand thingy to basically allow me easier access to nested arrays over here, because I couldn't assume that these positions are always fixed. So that's always my rule of thumb. I never specify things like hard-coded array indices as part of my KQL queries. So what I then basically needed to do, I needed to find out the display name of that administrative unit. As you can see here, this one was again part of an array, and we basically see here that new value. Now the issue is in that array, we have basically two objects, and I needed to get to that object over here. But now from a KQL perspective, that was quite difficult because the properties of the objects were always called display name, new value, and old value. So it wasn't that easy to filter the right thing out over here. So the solution for me was ultimately to basically leverage that MV apply function. Because that MV apply function is quite similar for those of you who are familiar with programming, to using like lambda expressions where you can filter the array and basically only get back the results that match our filter. So that MV apply goes basically through the list of objects over here. It basically checks the display name property, whether that one matches my expected value, where I said that I want to get back that administrative unit display name. Once it finds that one, I basically just introduce a new column to my result and basically get out here that corresponding new value itself. And with that, if we do that one fast forward, we basically see here directly the results. So from that weird nested thingy, we got back the display name of the administrative unit, the object ID of the administrative unit, the name of the device, and the device ID. These are all of the unique things we then actually needed to uniquely identify the device once that one got added to the restricted management administrative unit. One of the challenges, I'm not too sure actually, was the challenge regarding that new value was always enclosed in a quotation mark. That's quite weird because although this wasn't JSON anymore, somehow that schema, when they generate that audit logs, they always like prepend a quotation mark in front of the string. Maybe Johnny or Alex knows why is that. I didn't find it out, so I just choose that naive approach to replace basically the quotation mark at the beginning and the end to basically have normalized display and object IDs.
I think what happens if you maybe select it more specifically, then it will remove it. But if it assumes that you have could have multiple values, because if you're working with a dynamic, then it automatically appends the double quotes.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting because I like tried tons of things. So I tried to hard code it, access the index 0 to like convert back to JSON and forth, although like from the schema it said that it's a string. So to me it looked like that quotation mark got just added by the schema they use internally to generate the audit events. But yeah, I think there's always room for improvement.
And then select it with brackets. So you do parse JSON, your string, and then bracket 0. And then to string in front of it, then it will do it without quotes.
Yeah, I tried to do that one as well because I knew that from other challenges, but it didn't help in that case. Okay. So quite funny.
Cool.
Being there too. Questioning myself, like, I've had another case, but yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, that's usually, I think recently I wrote another query where that one actually helped, basically converting it to JSON and then back to string. And I just added a comment KQL weirdness because I wasn't sure whether how to do that or not, but I've seen that in a couple of other queries from other people. So yeah, some of the limitations probably then, if I could have a wish, I would wish that this one works a little bit better to basically explicitly specify the data type or things like that. But yeah, ultimately that one worked. So yeah, with that coming to the last example, to basically a little bit of a newer feature. So in our Entra ID, we have basically now passkeys available. So basically you can leverage your Microsoft Authenticator app and it will basically conform to the FIDO2 standard itself. So what I did over there was basically, first I was interested, how can we find out which users already registered passkey on their account? So that's quite an interesting thingy for itself, just to see what Microsoft did there internally, because they're like currently in a process of rebranding everything that was called FIDO2 security key to passkeys, and they basically now distinguish between device-bound passkey and passkey device-bound security key and things like that. That's also quite the nice differentiation over here. So in the earlier days, before we had passkeys in place, they called that registration of a FIDO2 security one, and you basically maintain a list here of attestation GUIDs. Those attestation GUIDs uniquely identify that FIDO2 security key. Of course, here we have a same or a similar situation as we had it before of mapping basically that tenant ID to a human readable format. So the interesting thing is that basically the FIDO Alliance does a thing about publishing all those attestation GUIDs of the FIDO2 keys or also the passkeys in the future. They call that thing like a metadata service blob. That's like a huge blob that contains all of the FIDO2 security keys, including the attestation GUID, including an image and things like that. So what I actually did, or what I actually do once a month, is I have here in my GitHub repository, I have a GitHub action that basically does a thing called dump attestation GUIDs. What it actually does, it leverages a list of that metadata service blob, and it basically combines all that information into a JSON. And if you have a closer look into that JSON file, I host that one on my GitHub repository. Then basically have a nice list of that attestation GUID and the human readable name of that FIDO2 security key. If you obtain the official metadata service blob, you can search for that one in Google. That's basically how they deliver that blob. If you acquire that one over here, you get quite a weird file because the file is called blob.jvt, where JVT basically stands for JSON Web Token. If we basically paste the contents of that blob into your favorite JVT decoder, you see that this blob is definitely huge because it's signed by them. And below here, we can then also see basically the decoded portion of that one. So again, the attestation GUID, including the image about the capabilities of that FIDO2 security key, also some more internal things like attestation certificates and things like that. So I got quite a good understanding about how those attestation things ultimately will work. But what I ultimately wanted to figure out is basically when I see such an event in my Entra ID, which FIDO2 security key did the user register? So what we can do, we can combine here 2 or 3 things. So the first thing that I did was basically specify a data table of the attestation GUIDs of the Microsoft Authenticator app, because those attestation GUIDs aren't yet in that public metadata service blobs. I then also leveraged that external data operator to just basically parse that JSON into a table that's understandable for the KQL engine itself. I query again the audit logs of my Entra ID and then just perform again a lookup of my manually specified attestation GUIDs over here and my external data file. If I do that again, I get like a nice result of my users and the name of the passkey they actually leverage to register over here. I think there's a small typo in it because from the external data perspective, this property was called name and not display name. I've just noticed. So let's quickly fix that to make the demo work properly. And then we need to say here name as well. So we basically see the events where the user registered a FIDO2 key or a passkey, and we see basically based on that attestation GUID directly which kind of passkey that was. Also, this is then again just the starting point. So what I'm actually trying to build, and in the finishing touches, probably a topic for a next blog post, would then basically be to trigger a logic gap. And as soon as the user registered a FIDO2 security key, add that user to a group. Towards that group, we have targeted a conditional access policy that will then also enforce the passkey or the FIDO2 security key for the sign-in. Because it's good if your users use passkeys and FIDO2 security keys and all this stuff. But for an attacker, especially if you're worried about those adversary in the middle phishing attacks, it's quite easy. They just override the user agent with their phishing toolkit to something that doesn't support passkeys, like an invalid browser or invalid platform, and the user will just get prompted with regular MFA. So the idea would then also be ultimately to enforce the passkey from a conditional access perspective via the require authentication strength control. Yeah, I think that also gave you a little bit of another impression how I used that external data one. I again used a little bit of PowerShell here to parse that metadata service blob and things like that. But ultimately, this then also helps to get some insights about all the passkeys your users registered. You could even create a little bit of a workbook based on that. Also had some ideas around that. So you could create a passwordless adoption dashboard to see how many users already registered passkeys if you're also testing those in your environment. And I think with that, I covered all my topics I wanted to talk about. If someone has any questions, feedbacks, or whatsoever, I think now it's the best time. Otherwise, I would then hand back over to Alex and Johnny.
Cool session, man. I like the content. You explained it nice, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks from my side as well. I guess this is yet a great example of how KQL can help you in your everyday's job. And I think you did a perfect pitch on that by basically taking, well, topics at least in our work life, that are the things that we do every day and how we can apply KQL to it. So yeah, thanks for sharing your insights and your experiences here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and for all those who are wondering where can I get the queries and all that stuff. So basically that's all part of my, I call it ITDR repository. So you now also know what that means. And yeah, some of the things I mentioned also posted blogs about that. So you find all the details over there as a short commercial break for my internet presence, because I didn't include that one in the introduction.
No worries. As always, we will add that as well to the show notes. So if you're watching and you don't have a pen or you don't want a screenshot, stay tuned for the show notes where we will share references about anything we speak during the show anyway as well. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Good.
Thanks for having me. It was great fun.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we get you back one day. Good. Then let's continue. And I believe Johnny has something to share. Yeah.
So here. So this month I wrote a blog post about the project Breeze, which is now the enhanced security for Edge for Business. So let me quickly talk about that one and then show you some case. So what they did is they enhanced, well, it's in public preview now, they are enhancing the old experience where you could protect data from the CloudApp security portal, where you could block, copy, paste, and allow things or monitor things. But what happened was that even though in the old way you were blocking copy and pasting, you were still able to press the F12 button and copy and paste some data from there. So what they did is they now integrate with the Edge for Business, and they have some extra controls in there to make the internet a safer place. So let me start showing it around a bit. Let's do a portal, no, security. This one. And then we go to Cloud Apps, Policies, and Policy Management. Because in here, they created session policies. So over here, I created some policies, for instance, block leakage through Office, block copy paste from Office, block download and uploads for malware. So let's monitor all activities. So let's just, for instance, open this one. So over here, what we do is basically we give it a name. We use the control type. And you can monitor block, control, or control upload, block, download, upload, and then you can target it with an app. In this case, I used Microsoft Online Services. You can even make it more specific if you want to do Office 365 only, then target it by all means on the Microsoft 365. Because if you are lazy like me and you tag it here, then you will also block downloads from Azure and from Intune. Maybe something to think about. But for now, in my test tenants, it worked perfectly, and I didn't want to play a lot around with the settings. And also, you have a preview button. There you can see everything that would have been hit with the specific rule. And then there are tons of more options. If you change the inspection method, you can do it for certain labels or protect it if it has a label. But for now, we'll leave this, and you can read all about it at the switch over to the CloudAppEvents table. CloudAppEvents is all data coming in from Cloud Apps to Defender. And let's just say in the last 12 hours. And you can see everything, file syncs, all goodness that you do in O365, which is going through the Cloud App portal. Also, if you have linked maybe HiQ or some other applications which are enabled or compatible by default with the Cloud App portal, then it's all here. But also for the new security layer, it's important that it works single sign-on. So it has to be an application where you have an app registration or enterprise application which uses single sign-on, and also the SAML 2.0 standards to be able to route through the proxy. But that aside, so if we go in the data, you can see we have all these nice audit sources. And these nice audit sources. And in this case, you have the session controls, you have the access controls. These two integrate with the new functionality. And you have the normal old Defender for Cloud Apps connector. So in this case, we were playing around with session controls. And in the session controls, you can see all the activity which is being handled by a session control. So we have paste items, cut and copy, there's download, upload, everything you can. And in this case, I wanted to trigger an alert so we know for sure that it was this one. Because what happened in this case, I was playing around and was it? I uploaded to my OneDrive. Let's see. I uploaded in this case Azure Hound. And for some reason, Microsoft didn't like my Azure Hound and blocked it based on the Microsoft Threat Intelligence. So it's a nice way that if we wanted to see in our environment upload files, and it should also be the status here somewhere. Oh, it's so for some reason I can't see that it was monitored or blocked. But in this case, it is nice to see if it's in the right event data. Oh. Oh. Okay. I can't seem to find that it's blocked now, but if you configure the policies and you don't do the monitoring, you should be able to create a detection for that. What you can also do is monitor for mass copy pasting or for mass downloading, mass uploading, those kinds of things. Those are all available here. So if you configure these kinds of things, these policies, then there are tons of cool features in there, and also the team is still working on it, so the fields and the functionality will increase. I believe I heard on the build news that there's also a new feature for screenshots, which would also be integrated in the new the Edge for Business browser. So that was one of the things I played with this month. Not sure if anyone has any questions regarding this feature or the queries.
Yeah, definitely. If you happen to, or let me add, if you have been using Defender for Cloud App, the proxy, at times, people felt like, performance-wise, this was a little bit slow because everything was basically really going through the reverse proxy. And with the Project Breeze, now basically everything, if I'm informed correctly, and if my testing was done right, now things actually happen within the browser, right?
Yes, it's much faster. And also you can't bypass it anymore. So that's also, you was able before to use some tricks to bypass the download blocking, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because now they're basically blocking the developer tools interface, right?
Yeah.
Do I have an option to actually choose whether the backend or the cloud-based reverse proxy is used versus using the browser? Or is it basically when I come with an Edge browser, it will basically default to using this methodology?
You have to be signed into your browser.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not working, if you're not signed into the browser, it will tell you, hey, you have to be signed in, and then you can go through. Or you can say, I want to continue without being signed in, and then you go through the old proxy. And I hope that the team is creating also methods maybe to block non-signed in browsers, or maybe to only allow certain applications through the non-signed in way, but that's still feature requests.
Okay. Good. Then, in the interest of time, let us proceed. I'll promise I'll keep it short. So basically, my little additions to what have you done this month. One of them, let me quickly find this. Okay, sorry for that. Need to share better. Okay, I'm just gonna share my whole screen and hope everyone has a large screen. Good. So this one is an interesting one. Actually, a colleague of mine came across this.
You zoom in a bit, Alex.
Yeah, for those familiar with the matter, when you have Microsoft Sentinel and you're, have an E5 license, basically Microsoft will give you 5 megabytes per user per day as a benefit for your ingestion. So if you ever wonder, I mean, there's a workbook to also look at that, but if you ever wonder, how much gigabytes, assuming you have like 1900 licenses, how many gigabytes are effectively being used, you can run the following query. It's in the operation table of your Azure logs. Look for this one, and then basically you will find a record every day, basically telling you the benefit amount used in gigabyte. Yeah, I wasn't really able to, to the dot number pinpoint this exactly with the results I saw in the Sentinel cost workbook, but I guess there's always a little variation, but it came close. So that's maybe good to know whether you are actually making use of your benefit. All the other information you find in the link here below. Then 2 other things I've been working on is, let me see here, this is the dynamic group memberships. So I am my use case currently is that I'm still fiddling around with getting the MDE settings management up and running. And as I had mentioned in my blog post, to create dynamic groups that represent the different server operating system versions. And well, I wanted to monitor a little bit, what is actually happening. So I ended up with this query. And because I like to make my life complicated, I also created a query for those that don't have the audit logs in Sentinel, but maybe have the Cloud Apps logs. And there I also came across an interesting topic, but let me first show you what the purpose is actually of this log. So here, if we see this in the audit logs, basically the information I get here is, okay, whether a device in this case was added or removed based on my Entra ID dynamic group rule that I have specified. So, and of course, if you use, if you use PIM reviews, etc., they probably also will end up here depending on what you have done. So be careful here with the Microsoft approval assignment. I could assume, having validated that this identity is also used for other purposes. Now, my interesting lesson learned here was the following: that as I was working on it, if you look here closely, you see here in the audit logs, I want to know operation name equals add member to group or remove member from group. So as I was actually then working on my Cloud App query, I thought, well, I just copy paste those things, and I never got a result until I took a closer look and found out that here we have exactly the same operator, but it has this little dot. So be mindful, take a look at your CloudAppEvents, do a distinct action type, and you will find a number of action types that actually have the dot included in here. So that was an interesting lesson learned from this one. Another one I had already posted a while ago, but now extended some of the queries. This is all about the Microsoft attack disruption, where I basically want to identify whether a domain controller actually took an action. So basically, I first get to know all my domain controllers in my environment, and then I'm basically looking at any identity directory events, so Active Directory events, where an account was disabled and where the activity was initiated by a device and not by a user. So if I had manually disabled the user, I would see probably my account, but in this case I am the domain controller. So as we can see here, my lab domain controller 1 disabled Sam Brown and Jane Cooper. Now, to take it a step further, because ideally when I disable the accounting on-prem Active Directory, that account gets synchronized by Azure AD sync, and I want now also to see whether that account now was disabled and synchronized further into Entra ID. So as we can see here, I can see that the operation name is disable account, and because it was Entra ID sync that did that, I can now here see my sync account from my Entra ID Connect and the targeting account that was actually disabled. So to make the story complete, to summarize, where it is here. First, whenever an account is being disabled by attack disruption, or by me going to the portal and say disable him, if the activity is then executed by the Defender for Identity, we will see an activity here, and later we should see this one. To be more precise, let me quickly share the following. let us know. You know where to find us. You can also write us privately through LinkedIn or X. The show, as always, will be published soon. Actually, today we will publish the last show. Always takes us a little bit of time because we have to cut out things. Hopefully not for today. And yeah, next month we also have a great guest. Let me quickly bring that up so that I pronounce the name correct. Experiences and knowledge around KQL. So without further ado, I would say have a great evening, everyone, and see you at the latest in a month.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one, and see you next time.
Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.